Good morning and welcome to the Space Madness Podcast. This is your host, Jeff Nosanov, and I think this is episode 28 of a series of discussions with interesting people from around the space industry and trying to understand what makes them tick and how they got there and what they really think about. So today we have with us Michael Rudolph. He is a former system engineer from JPL and currently a board member at the Quicycle Society, which is an international physics think tank. And I thought he'd be an interesting guest because the journey from designing missions, hands-on engineering, down to the individual subsystems and details, going from that level all the way up to international thinking on science as a more abstract concept, that's a really interesting journey. You don't see a lot of people crossing that gulf, or at least I haven't. Usually people are either scientists or engineers. So I'm excited to dig into this. But one of the things we're going to talk about this morning is creating institutions and managing them so they last a long time and they can actually make an impact in the long term, despite things that happen in the meantime. Also relevant today as a lot of our scientific institutions in the United States are facing identity crises. So I think this is a good topic for this time. So with that, Michael, any more introductions you'd like to make before we get going?
I'll just add in the middle there between JPL and what I'm doing now. I spent 7 years leading a research and development group, obtaining SBIRs, principal investigator as various contracts for AI applications in aerospace.
Okay, so that's really interesting kind of glue between the hands-on engineering and the more abstract science and leadership stuff. So this should be a very interesting story. So I'm curious if we could start about where did your love for space exploration come from? What point in your life did you decide this is what you were going to do?
It was in college, actually. I from as long as I can remember as a young child, I wanted to be an architect. So I was fascinated by like how all the little details of a building that you walk into affect your feelings, your life, your success, but then once I got through a semester of architecture, I was at the Rose Parade in Pasadena and the B-2 bomber flew super low overhead. I was like, that's cool. I want to build those. I want to be around these big, loud machines. So I switched to astronautical engineering and then got a job out of school to go work at JPL.
Okay. Yeah. You had mentioned, I think in your LinkedIn profile, you mentioned about architecture as a method of kind of affecting human psychology with structure and form, something like that.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting transition. So can you tell me a little more about that? Because I think it does connect to the institutional stuff that we're both very interested in.
Yeah, it's. I think what fascinates me about it is there's like this balance between the analytical side of your brain and sort of the emotional, artistic side. And I've always had kind of both. And so what interested me about architecture was, things like when you walk up to a building, can you immediately tell where the entrance is? If not, it was a poorly designed building. Same kind of thing if you go up to a door and you push on it, but it's a pull door. It's not your fault. It's because it was a poorly designed door. Because we have these, expectations that are sort of subconscious, this knowledge that we have about the world, and that affects how we interact with it. And the same thing is applied in science. There's a whole field of trying to effectively communicate science to the public because they speak different languages. Scientists speak a different language than people. So I ended up through, interviewing at a bunch of different groups on my interview day at JPL, getting hired into the systems engineering formulation group. And looking back on it, it was a perfect fit because that was their job. They were translators between scientists with their goal and the engineers about what they can actually build. And they don't speak the same language and they often talk past each other. And your job is to make sure that they build something that works.
Yeah. And I had my own exposure to that on the formulation side of actually getting science and engineering people to speak the same language just in the proposal speak, even before the actual question of what could be engineered. But even the difference, I'll never forget that realizing one person was speaking in wavelengths and one was in frequency, and realizing that, wow, this is more than just a units mismatch. This is actually a different way of thinking that actually really matters and flows all the way back to different points of view about how to get things done. So, okay. So I'm just curious, what was your first day at JPL, or what day was that, or year at least?
It was in 2008.
Okay. So yeah, and you were there for almost 10 years. So I think in the meantime, you said you lived in a castle in Scotland for a while.
Well, not a castle, but yeah, I did live in Scotland for a couple of years.
Okay. Or maybe I mixed that up. Yeah. Did you live in some old building? Is that why I'm thinking castle?
Yeah, that's right. And
Okay.
it was
Okay.
in Newtown of Edinburgh, which is like 400-year-old building.
So that must have been a really interesting kind of shift from JPL, from architecture JPL to a 400-year-old town. I mean, I'm curious how you got there, how you picked that. How did it change your thinking? Because you did seem to take a kind of a sharp turn
Yeah.
after that experience.
So I took a year off in the middle, 2012, of my time at
Mm.
JPL and just traveled around the world. And of all the places I visited, Edinburgh was the one that spoke out most to me of like a place to go return to. And
Huh.
I had the opportunity to go back there and just move there. And it
Mm.
was a really fascinating experience from like the technology and engineering history that I hadn't been aware of. Because as you might be familiar, there was the Scottish Enlightenment, which happened in the
Mm.
1800s. This is where like the theory of evolution came about, the detailed theories of human biology that became the people that were doing that in the US. The first doctors all were trained by these folks in um, Edinburgh. There's a huge doctor's school there, and there's actually this weird doctor's museum that's full of these vials of parts of people that have been, hundreds of years old
Okay.
collected. But it was the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution out of a set of thinking that happened in Edinburgh. And so Edinburgh is
Mm.
a very small walkable town, and it is sort of built around pubs. So you
Mm.
live in your house, but then after work you would go to the pub and hang out there. So what you had then was you had engineers talking to scientists, talking to doctors around the drinking tables
Oh.
in this small town. And that kind of enabled this Scottish Enlightenment. This is where, what's that economic book? Thomas Paine, maybe. Anyway, the theory of economics that we built modern society on was there as well. A whole bunch of things.
Common sense. Common sense.
Common Sense, Thomas
Thomas
Paine.
Paine.
And there was
Yeah.
a theory of economics. It was a different book. There's a statue of him there.
Okay.
It'll come to me later. But also the theory of geology. So there was a geologist who lived around there as well, who was looking at the stratification of rocks, and he came up with the
Mm.
fact that the Earth was much older and came up with ways to sort of define that. So you can see how that ties into evolution, thinking of a theory of
Yeah.
evolution. All these people were doing this at the same place.
Wow.
Yes,
So what you're really saying is that the people who are arguing against remote work, they really might be onto something, unfortunately.
unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, that is really interesting. I did not know that about that period. So it sounds like a very inspiring place to explore. And I I'm curious about another time we could talk about. I'm curious how that stood out about all the other places you went. I don't know what those are, but that's still really interesting. So I can see now how that got you thinking about institutions sitting in a 400-year-old pub, where people might have thought through electricity and magnetism, or maybe the germ theory, or who knows what. So, okay. So then you came back and what was it like to come back to JPL after that? I mean, after that first, that travel year.
It was very nice, actually. It was wonderful to travel and see and learn everything,
Mhm.
but I also kind of missed working, like doing something
Sure.
productive.
Sure.
Just living a life of enjoyment is great, but you need something
Mhm.
to some way to contribute, or I did anyway. So
Sure.
that was nice, and I felt like the first 6 months back, I did a year's worth of work easily, maybe 2 years of work. I was
Okay.
just productive.
Sure.
Yeah.
So after all these experiences, the travel and the living abroad and the small SBAR type of work, at what point did you start thinking bigger? I mean, institution across space and time, so to speak.
Yeah, so I mean, it was kind of on my mind when I left JPL in 2019, seeing how it was set up, how my first kind of lesson at JPL from the person who hired me was she'd been working on a project and she found out from C-SPAN that it had been canceled. And it was like a huge project to go out to Jupiter with a big, thermonuclear power source. And it was through PDR, all this work by hundreds of
Mhm.
people for years, just
Wow.
basically thrown in the trash. And that's just the reality of working research with the federal government. You're at the whim of Congress, who has very little idea what you do, and they just can't know what all the scientists are doing. But
Yeah.
that's part of that system. And so it just bothered me that there was a sort of structural problem, like all this great science, all these great
Mm.
people and engineers working at JPL and other research institutions, and yet they were not able to control their destiny in a way that I really thought that they should be able to, or at least society would benefit better from them having more.
Sure. I can relate to that. I remember I got into business development and proposal management basically from the beginning, which is unusual. And what I learned from that really is the fragility of all of this, of a successive series of space missions to increasingly more ambitious destinations. I mean, and we're seeing that now as we speak. The government might be halfway through reopening, but Mars sample return seems unlikely to execute in its original form, at least. So this is really a timely topic of how do we create long-lasting institutions that can communicate value and meaning over time. And I was in a conversation earlier where if the government reopens this week, my understanding is it'll be a 3-month CR or something like that. And I remember thinking to myself, how much of my work can I get done with NASA in 3 months? And I thought, what a crazy question. Maybe they can get some proposals reviewed and schedule a meeting or another mission review that I'm involved in. But this is ridiculous. We can't,
Yeah.
if this is the norm now, just negotiations and Congress failing into a shutdown, this is not the way to run a McDonald's, let alone, exploring the solar system. So
Yeah.
I know I keep saying this, but it's a timely question. So what was your conclusion, if I might be so bold, about, how to move forward, or maybe that should be the end of our call, but it sounds like you came to the conclusion that the institution is actually a bigger issue than the missions. And that in order to have a world where we do these missions, we need to dramatically improve the institution. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah. That's
a different sandbox, right? Than how many kilograms can you put on the rocket? So, and a harder one. So as you left JPL, and worked for other institutions, how did your thinking evolve in that area?
Well, so I was working for the government at JPL with this very neat and interesting FFRDC approach run by Caltech. So it was, about the benefits of that, but for anyone listening, it's like kind of a university freedom environment, also with very rigorous government program and accountability mixed together, which is cool. And I thought leaving that, going into the commercial world, I'd have a lot more freedom. But I tried to do the commercial world of like, okay, we're going to make some new technology. We're going to develop it. We're going to get funding from the government to develop it. And then we're going to turn it into product and sell it. Those steps sound very straightforward, but the challenging part is getting enough money early on when you don't have anything. You have just like hope and a prayer and an idea to actually get it to a point where it's de-risked enough to then be picked up by someone who's willing to invest in it for a market application, like a VC kind of thing or any kind of business investor. And that's, as you know, the valley of death is that funding gap.
And for the audience, the valley of death is what we refer to as sort of the gap between good idea with obvious applications, but a long enough period of development and testing that it scares away most of the money, whether from the government or otherwise, that would otherwise be interested in the return. And in an increasingly commoditized world where the larger organizations are looking for incremental changes for short-term stock performance, it's harder to say, hey, if we invest this now, we'll have a major improvement later. Yes. And so it's actually the same problem between the commercial sector and government. It's just with different definitions of return and investment and so on. I believe this just the innovator's dilemma. I haven't read that in a long time, but I think that's also describes the same thing. And particularly so in the space world where the market is a little less, it's a large market, but everyone still wants the government to be their customer because they're still the biggest and best customer. So an interesting challenge to be sure. So how did you go from, where did you go from there kind of in your thinking, having reached that, made that observation in the commercial sector?
Well, I spent like 7 years working to get funding to get it through each steps. And as I kept doing that, I kept seeing this disconnect between government programs like the SBR program that say one thing and then they actually do something else. So they say that they're going to bring you to commercialization potential and it's very important and they're going to help you with that. At least as an SBR PI for NASA, we really don't mean to say anything negative about these programs because they're fantastic and they do a great job, but they're insufficient. Because NASA says, yes, we're going to put all these phase 1 SBIRs. So you apply to one, you have a very low chance of success, you win it. All right. Then you do really good work for a year or 6 months, whatever the contract is. And then you have another application process and you have a very low chance of succeeding there, but you apply anyway and you win it. Okay. So now you have 2 years of funding and that's great. And then that's when the valley of death begins, because at that point you need someone at NASA to say, yeah, I'm going to put that in my mission. But nobody at NASA, no program manager, no engineer is incentivized or interested in taking the risk on a new project, a new technology. So it's structurally unsound, despite all these brilliant people within the structure they've been given trying to solve the problem and seeing the problem.
Yeah. And that's despite NASA having other programs than SBIR that in theory, each step forward of maturation, you have in theory a program to test and validate and improve. I mean, most of my experience is with NIAC. So there's NIAC, and then there's flight opportunities, aircraft flight opportunities, tipping point technology programs. But when it comes down to, as you and I both know, when a mission is getting put together or a concept is getting put together, it's all about the TRL and the low TRL, technology readiness level, for everybody. The lowest one is the one that stands out when you're putting together the mission, and is, I imagine, on the review side is the one that stands out the most.
Yeah.
So what can we do? How do you see, if you could draw it from a blank page, how do you envision a different system? Hopefully better, but at least a different one.
Well, we have some examples from history. So I've been doing a bunch of research on this recently and I haven't finished it. So I don't have the full answer yet, but at least enough to start the conversation. Before I started this research, I'd heard of Bell Labs as like this
Mm.
amazing place that did a lot of research. And they were, I think, 60 years of groundbreaking technologies. They invented the transistor, which enables us to have this conversation on a
Mm.
computer video call. They invented long distance communication. They laid the first deep sea cables. They helped develop
Um,
the first satellites. I mean, all of this stuff that basically enabled the foundation of our modern society. And they did it as a private company. And the reason they could do it as a private company is because they had a monopoly protection. So they were part of
mm.
AT&T, and they were, I guess, found themselves in the position to be the only person providing only company providing telephone service, and they were the world's biggest company at their peak. So this was a huge economic effort, employing I think it was tens of thousands of people. And so then they had this Bell Labs, which was totally insulated because they had guaranteed funding as a monopoly. Everyone's using the telephone system. They had 30-year time horizons. So no one was going to come in and say, oh, you've been working on that for 4 years? Stop it. I don't understand it, but
Yeah.
stop it and do something else. The actual experts in the system and technology could decide which directions were most fruitful. But it wasn't
Mm.
just open. It wasn't like just come up with something cool. It was like very specific to the mission of improving communications. So
Mm.
when you first did a voice telephone signal, you had a copper wire and you had attenuation and you had losses. So it was hard to hear the other person. So you needed these amplifiers. So someone had invented the vacuum tube, which was an amplifier. And so that was brought into Bell Labs and they built it up. But then vacuum tubes were fragile. They would break every once in a while. So you needed something more reliable. So then they had a whole bunch of people over many, many years looking at alternative approaches. So they had physicists, material scientists, engineers, environmentalists, all in the same place with, basically enough funding for 25,000 people to be working on this stuff at its peak, right? It's just mind blowing.
Wow. And that was in the 50s, right? At least on the transistor.
That was 1949. Transistor was
49.
invented. Yeah.
So some really interesting observations there. So it's almost a fluke that they had that power, because the phone system was before that, and then World War II created a national economic environment and a tax environment. I don't think it's controversial to say that really incentivized that, and so they had the monopoly and the tax incentive system to reinvest into the company. So that's almost, to me, it's sounding almost as unique of a combination of factors as the Apollo program itself, the geopolitics and the tax base and all of that other stuff. So
Totally.
that's really interesting. So you can't engineer that kind of environment. That's the kind of thing that has to happen almost organically. Like
Right.
there was a
Like rolling the
national
dice.
monopoly for the phone system because it all had to work together. And it being new, you couldn't force a bunch of interfaces between different things. So that's almost like a once in a century kind of a setup, like the invention of the car or the computer or the phone. So plus the national economic environment that did not hyper focus on short term. I should say that the national tax incentive environment that did not focus on short term performance. Okay, so any other examples? You mentioned you studied a number of them.
Yeah. So those examples were about like constant funding and
Mm.
vertically integrated team, like they share the same cafeteria with different expertises. Another interesting one
Like
was,
the pubs in
yeah,
Edinburgh.
yeah, it's a common theme. And then another interesting one was, well, this follows on from Bell Labs, because Bell Labs invented the transistor, but because they had a monopoly on telecommunications, they were forbidden
Mm.
from going into other industries. So they were not allowed to go into the burgeoning computer
Oh,
industry that they had
okay.
invented. So they had
Huh.
to freely release all their patents. Well, they had to license them at a low fee, but they were also like helping other companies to implement their learnings. So that enabled
Wow.
groups like Intel to come up and become, the chip manufacturer.
So I did. Okay. So they had, so that when you said they had a monopoly, it sounded like they were effectively exempt from anti-monopoly actions by the government, right? That they had the actual physical monopoly of all making the same phones, but they also, there was some agreement or some status that they did not get, the SEC at the time did not take issue with it, right?
Well, yeah. And in the 40s, they were starting to get investigated, but then World War II happened. So after
Oh.
I think it was in the 60s that the legal process finally came through and was like, nope, you guys are too big. We need to break you apart. And that's when Bell Labs fell apart, because then they got converted over. Quarterly earnings kind of
Huh.
pressure didn't have the long-term sustainability.
So it's not just a coincidence of World War II. It's that the outbreak of World War II prevented an anti-competitive investigation that could have strangled this thing 20 years earlier. So that makes it even harder to engineer, because you have these global events. Wow. Interesting. I'm sure we could go on about Bell Labs, but any other
Yeah.
work?
So the transition from that, then the segue from that, is one of the companies that started Silicon Valley, or maybe the first one, was made by Bill Shockley. He was one of the initial creators of the transistor, or at least the boss of the people creating it. And so he went out to Silicon Valley, started this company. It ended up falling apart because of some issues we could get into, but a few people, so he brought people from all over the country to his hometown of Sacramento, I think it was, somewhere in the Bay Area. And that was the beginning of computer science in Silicon Valley. A bunch of people left his company and started Intel and other places. And Xerox Labs was started some around there in Silicon Valley. And they had a lot of very talented researchers, and they invented the modern computer, like the graphical user interface, memory, architecture, networking, Ethernet. All of this was made in this one group that was given the right freedoms. But they worked for Xerox, which was a printer company. Xerox's headquarters was on the East Coast. So Xerox saw this personal computer. They'd actually built them, and they were using them in their offices, talking to each other on a network. Like, they were useful for them in their own work. And Xerox was like, I can't sell that. We do printers, because they sell printers to enterprise. So they totally passed on it. But then they had an opportunity to invest in Apple when it was taking its first IPO. So they got what now looks like a small stake in Apple for giving Steve Jobs the ability to look around their factory, or look around their research lab. So Steve comes in, and there's this story of him going in and saying, "What are you guys doing? This is gold. Why are you not selling this?" And they couldn't sell it, because they couldn't convince their managers that it was worth doing, because it was in a different market vertical. So, if it's just all these structural problems, right? There's no reason that they couldn't have the lab be set up so that it can provide its technology to many potential startups, which is what ended up happening, because people left there. And the guy who invented Ethernet started 3Com, which became a huge thing and owned by Cisco.
I didn't know about.
The guy who invented the object-oriented programming language they were using, I think that's what it was, went to Microsoft and started Microsoft Word and Microsoft Office, and became a billionaire in the process. They made everything, but they couldn't capitalize on it, and the people knew it was important, so they went to other places that would enable them to.
Yeah, and you reminded me of it escapes me at the moment, but this pattern of people leaving. It'll come back to me. I don't want to waste the audience's time trying to remember. But sorry,
I just remembered Wealth of Nations was the name of that book. Book from Edinburgh.
Okay. And by the way, I think that the heading or the title of this episode is going to be something like "The Power of the Pub" or something like that. From JPL to, I don't know, to Scotland. I'll have to think of some alliteration, but this theme of getting people in the same room, I'm just thinking of the JPL cafeteria. So Xerox, and before we go on, any other companies stand out? Particularly, I'm curious, anything else from the Bell Labs era, from the 40s and 50s?
I think there were other ones. I think DuPont also, for chemical, like Teflon, took decades to invent, decades of patient capital and investment to make work.
Interesting.
So there were a number of these big corporate labs at that time, and they all, for various reasons similar to Bell Labs, broke apart, because the corporate mindset became more profitable to license technologies from elsewhere, or make incremental improvements, because there's so many incremental improvements you can make in the modern era, because there's so much technology out there.
So how do we take these lessons and move forward creating something? It's also never been easier to start organizations like this, whether it's, just my guest from yesterday was from the Interstellar Research Group. So another kind of enthusiast turned serious work kind of project that with, of course, all this communication technology is we can now connect. We don't need to go to a pub, although it still has an appeal. So what do we do with all of this insight? How can we create something kind of in parallel with the institutions we already have?
Yeah, and that's key. It's got to be something that builds off of and complements what's existing, because there's all these fantastic institutions like government funding programs,
Mm,
current corporate labs, VC institutions for accelerators of startup companies, and all the universities doing research. But going back to what we were talking in the very beginning about translating, right? There's huge cost to taking something that was developed by a bunch of scientists at a university. There's huge communication cost and bottleneck, taking that they publish in papers and making it something that can be turned into a product. Like, as another example from, I think it was 1980, somewhere around there, this gentleman named Goodenough invented a
mm,
cathode that is in all of our lithium ion batteries. And he enabled that entire industry. And he came up with this at Oxford, and then Oxford didn't want to patent it because at that time,
mm.
universities didn't patent things. So he found some lab nearby that would, some government lab that would pay for the patenting. And then they forgot about it. They
Wow.
sat on it for 11 years. And then Sony called them up and said, hey, we're trying to build batteries because we've got this Walkman and it needs to have a better battery life. And we found your paper and we found your patent. Can we license it?
Wow.
And so that's the state of the art. That's how this stuff happens. It's like,
Sure.
it's a communication gap. A better situation, asking, what we could do differently, a better situation would be there's an institute with people who are experts in marketing, experts in the
Mm,
in the market, experts in selling things, experts in the physics behind things, and experts in R&D and testing. And they sift through a bunch of applications every year and they pick, that's
mm,
a promising thing. And we're going to help. And if you're going to actually do that and get it to a product that's going to need $50 million over 5 years and might not
mm,
work, you need to be able to take risks, because, just because it works on paper or works in a lab doesn't mean
mm.
there's a feasible economical way to scale it to consumer application.
Yeah.
So that takes a large amount of money to fund multiple projects simultaneously. It takes an institution of people to be able to make these decisions, but it's doable. I mean, it's not, making up some novel kind of physics. It's just engineering
Right.
people.
Yeah. Engineering people. I like that. And there's pieces of that out there. I mean, most universities have a tech transfer office that
Mhm.
likes to. My experience, I'll try to be neutral about it, but the experience that I had, they would like to believe they're doing that important work, but they're, in my experience, the one I worked with was more. They were more worried about a project failing and them looking bad than they were excited about the possibility of a project succeeding. So
Yep.
you have walls built up around.
And that's a structural problem. It's not,
Yeah.
you can put the best person in the world, the most talented, experienced person in that situation, but if their
Right.
incentive structure is set up wrong, then you
Right.
don't get what you need out of them.
Yeah, and the another example is the VC model, where some of them have a portfolio distribution that allows longer term risk, longer term returns rather. But still, there's a lot of when I was starting my one venture backed company 10 years ago, was a lot of people said that they were doing venture funding, but they were really doing growth funding. And to me, maybe I just didn't understand the word venture properly, but to me, it meant earlier, ambitious stuff. Of course, everyone wants to believe they're, reinventing the next wheel. Probably was on my interpretation at the time, but it
Well,
was
it's
an
it's an
interesting
issue with the
lesson
messaging.
nonetheless.
It's
Yeah,
an issue
yeah,
with the messaging for sure, because when Bell Labs broke up, the
mm,
agreement that the United States came to in terms of what we expect is that universities do discovery and
mm,
startups and VCs, private investment, turn it into products. But
mm,
there's the missing part. VCs don't want to fund, to your point, about taking that initial idea and de-risking it sufficiently that
yeah,
it's worth putting that money into.
yeah. And this is a topic of contemporary discussion of how do we incentivize the growth of new organizations in the United States. And the more you share about the Bell Labs experience, it couldn't be more transparent to me that the government's role is to fund the stuff that has no obvious return. And I don't think that was controversial for 50 years. And in fact, when you look with the way you describe Bell Labs, it had so many guardrails around it, whether the monopoly or the rule that it had to license it it almost sounds more like a public-private partnership than a corporation. And I can't escape that conclusion at the scale it was operating and the impact that it was having, presumably contributing to the larger AT&T bottom line and share price performance. So, and the term public-private partnership is growing in the space field. I mean, what do you think about that? Obviously, that can mean a number of different things. But for what I'm hearing is all of these different incentives set up for Bell, really were evidence. The evidence shows that they were really effective in this way. So, what do you think about trying to reproduce that now in some kind of modern public-private partnership?
Well, the challenge with having government be responsible for this is exactly what you just said about the TTO officers. They're afraid of failure. And there's good reason for that
Yeah,
because they're accountable to
yeah.
their constituents. And if there's a failure, then it's like, oh, you're wasting my money. But this valley of death specifically needs to have failure. If you're like
Mhm.
DARPA has a rule that if you're not failing 70% of the time, then you're not taking enough risk. And that's what you need for that bridging the gap. And DARPA does this fantastically and has done it very well for, I think it's 66 years or something,
Mhm.
but only for defense applications.
Sure.
And you might notice that, DARPA invented the internet or had a big hand in it, stealth aircraft, a GPS, but these were all decades ago. And
Mm.
DARPA's model is to sort of network things. They take the best people from university, from corporate labs, pull them together on a project and make something happen. But if those corporate labs have now sort of degraded to the point they don't do this middle research, which is what's happened since the last 30 years, that limits what DARPA can do. So,
Interesting.
yeah, I mean, like government certainly has a lot of money and should pay for these kinds of things, but it has to be done in a way that there's no risk to the government because the government doesn't want to take risks.
No risk to the government. Yeah, I'm just thinking of the last 30 or so years of planetary exploration. I mean, the shift to better, faster, cheaper in the 90s, that's
Yeah.
sort of represented. I mean, I'm curious how you see that in the terms of the evolution of the relevant institutions, right? Because clearly there was an awareness that they had to be more risk averse or at least deliver more value. What do you think changed there?
I mean, I have to dig into a little more to look at what was progressing, but
Mm,
you know, the faster, better, cheaper is kind of I'm sure you can have two, not three. You can pick two and
right,
optimize. You can't have all three.
right.
And they were saying we need all three because they wanted to like push the organization, but then that made the organization kind of like schizophrenic a little bit, and then had
Mm,
some major failures. Um, like
yeah,
significant missions failed.
I wonder.
The goal was like, we have a limited budget and we need to have results and you guys need to perform more to justify your existence. But yeah, I haven't
It
researched
seems
that.
almost like pushing on one tiny part of the institution or one institution in a web and hoping that would fix it
Yeah.
instead of the larger institution that is the United States. And I think I'd argue that it's now a global web of institutions that are all interacting, particularly in the flow of capital around the world and the way that higher amounts of international capital deliver relative to what's delivered locally. So if it was 100 years ago and the U.S. was still, well, let's say 75 years ago, the U.S. was economically dominant, technologically dominant. You didn't have a point of comparison that could message that domestically something could be done better, right? But now you have enormous amounts of wealth moving around the world that then an American domestic investment almost has to be compared to, right?
Yeah.
And I would argue that perception is potentially leading to the current attacks on a lot of our institutions, but going too far, and that the institutions change a lot slower than the points of comparison, particularly when it comes to capital and venture capital models, that have that 70% failure rate. Oh, excuse me, this is our co-host Wednesday. Has finally decided to join. So it's an interesting set of problems. I mean, how big the problem rapidly becomes so large that it becomes almost intractable. How do you deal with that in your own thinking?
It is a huge problem. If you look at the number of inventions that are patented or the number of patents that come out of universities, small fraction, I think it was like 30%, I checked the number,
Mm,
actually get commercialized. So even if most of the remaining 40, 70% were not worthy of commercialization, that's a huge number. Like, what if one of those was as important as the transistor? Like, how
yeah.
many era-defining technologies have been invented in a lab today in the United States and are not being converted because they haven't been de-risked through careful long-term?
Yeah. Or they're in someone's file cabinet behind a locked door that, is you need 3 appointments to get into. This is
Yeah.
something that I really wondered a lot when I was dealing with the University Tech Transfer Office, because I was literally in the office and saw the file cabinets. And I thought, wow, there's probably $50 billion worth of investment in there over 50 years of federal investment at this major university. And who knows how much value, but there's a mismatch in the effort in actually exploring that. That could be a really interesting use of large language models, actually. Imagine if all that was digitized. The bottleneck of needing humans to read things, is rapidly going away in a really strange way. So I'm sure they'd love that. Hey, let us in, and not just that, let us upload everything to our large language model. They might be wisely reluctant to do that, but maybe there is some version of this that could make an impact.
Well, I could tell them that the example of the mRNA vaccine, the
Mhm.
Technology Transfer Office sold that patent for $300,000, which was subsequently sold twice, 7 years later for $75 million, and ended up netting them like almost $2 billion in license fees. That's how they
Wow.
undervalued the value of that patent by 6,000 times.
The
For
university
the
originally did.
university did,
Wow.
because they just didn't appreciate it.
Yeah.
They didn't have any way to appreciate it.
Interesting. If only they had been in a pub with some MBAs.
Right.
It really comes back to the pub, or at least that meeting of the minds between different fields, doesn't it?
Yeah. And that's where your point about AI is absolutely valid. I think an organization like this that needs to exist could not have existed without
Mm-hmm.
enormous expense 10 years ago, but now maybe it's a lot more feasible because you have to
Hmm.
understand and sift through all this market research, all
Yes.
this discovery and patent portfolio and papers and bring it together.
I remember finally what I was forgetting 20 minutes ago. One of the first things I tried to do at JPL in my naivete was I said, hey, these mission formulation people, why don't we create like an internal Amazon.com for them? So all the systems are available and you can just sort of drag and drop, and all the, interfaces will understand each other. And in my defense, it was my first year, but someone looked at me and said, where are you going to get this information? And I learned of the commercial and other obstacles that are inherent in this sort of development that people don't want to share. You can't even get a price of some components without going through 10 hoops, right? Yet another factor of the system that we have now. And in my own small business, I feel that all the time, not wanting to share prices despite really not wanting to feel that way. So
Yeah.
some interesting challenges. But I'm really, I want to kind of, as we move to a conclusion, I'm glad you mentioned the mRNA example, because I'm going to look into that now or later because I'm really curious. But I wonder, the tech transfer office that overlooked that. I mean, how many people work there? How
Oh
many
yeah.
staff members do they have? Like, did it just go into a database that was presumed to be sort of secret, or because they couldn't, the right people clearly didn't see it. So
Well, it's even more tragic than that. The inventor um, wanted to commercialize it, but they couldn't come to an agreement. Negotiating for 6 years, they wouldn't sell the licenses on reasonable terms. I don't know the details of
uh,
it to the scientists to start her own company to do this. And so
so
then they
they
ended up
wouldn't.
selling it to some company that had no
Okay.
potential,
Yeah.
it wasn't even the right industry.
Wow. So okay. Yes. So it is even worse. So they wouldn't do the necessary work themselves, and they wouldn't let her do it. So it is that sort of obstructionist. We're afraid it would fail. I'm assuming, or a lack of competent valuation, basically.
Yeah, and
Wow. And they wouldn't
they
even let her try and fail.
right, because she
Wow.
wasn't my guess, and I don't know the specifics, I haven't talked to her about it, but, was that they viewed her not as a professional business person, so it was
Right.
risky that she might do it, as you're saying, fail, but then this other company, they were just gonna pay $300,000 for it, so that's on the
Sure.
books, success.
Yeah. Looks good. It's a quick win, isn't it?
Mm.
Wow. Well, I think we've covered a lot here today. We've gone pretty kind of abstract, specific, some wonderful history of the technological titans of our age. Lots to think about. Now I want to talk to you later offline about this, applying LLMs to tech transfer offices. It's interesting to see what bottlenecks are being broken by modern technology developments like LLMs. But in the form of this sort of virtual pub that you and I are sitting in right now, I don't think we'll ever, well, I shouldn't say that. It would be quite a change if that meeting of the minds of different specialties ever kind of surpassed the human interaction level. Maybe the AIs can do that now. I actually done some experiments where I'll talk to the Google Gemini AI voice assistant about scientific and engineering principles that I know, and see if it accurately knows them. And I'll ask it questions and see if I can kind of trick it into saying something wrong. And it's hard. The level of context and interpretation is sufficient to at least not easily be led off course. So it's an interesting world. Maybe that will play a role in the future institutions we design, maybe get around some of these challenges.
Yeah, maybe it will. It's an interesting, that's its own interesting institutional issue or cultural issue, because even if it's brilliant, right? Even if your Gemini is the best, more intelligent than Einstein, how do you know? How do you trust it? Are you going to trust it to do surgery on your child? Probably not.
Yeah. Or build a high energy experiment. It's a similar version of that volume problem where you can't evaluate every single patent, or maybe you can, but for some reason it doesn't happen. Maybe the future version of that is you can't evaluate every idea the AI has.
Right. What would a successful institution that would solve this for the United States today have to look like? What would it need to embody?
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me. This was really thought-provoking. I look forward to answering that question with you someday.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It should be a good challenge. Thanks again. And thanks everybody for joining the Space Madness podcast, and we'll see you next time.